It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Shadya Davis, who comes to us from Howard University in Seaford. I've known Shadya for a couple of years now, 2 or 3 years. She's been working with our NSF COPE project. This has been a great experience for me because Shadya deals in the world of social science and extreme weather. My whole career was been doing the meteorological side, so interacting with Shadya over the years and others has just been extremely eye-opening, and has actually changed my philosophy on approaching this, because I can't remember his first name, Murphy, back early 90s said, a forecast is only as good as people, take action, interpret it. And so you can have a perfect forecast, right? And if people don't take the appropriate action, it's useless, right? Or it's not very useful. So anyhow, Shadya is actually a postdoc there at Howard, actually working with the NOAA Global Systems Lab. Yeah. So she has direct ties with NOAA and the Weather Service. It's right there, collaborating with them. And as I already suggested, her area of interest and research has been in this area of social science. Basically how people interpret extreme weather and take action and so forth, communication issues and so forth, decision making. A little bit more background on Shadya. She got her PhD at Howard a few years ago or so, or a couple of years, but maybe a couple of years. And then she went to Penn State, did a postdoc there, 2022 to 2023, working on an important topic with the Weather Service. We have a few folks here on the impact of IDSS and some of the folks there and how they are interpreting things. That's their decision support service within the Weather Service, which is a big paradigm shift for them as well in terms of thinking about the forecast process. And so then, then she went to Howard here for her latest postdoc. And so let's welcome Shadya here.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Yes, just as you said, like my entire philosophy is really just trying to encourage and incorporate those human aspects of meteorology. And because of that work that I'm doing with IDSS and decision support services, it's not just about the end user or the person who's receiving the forecast, but I'm also quite interested in meteorologists themselves and what it is that they're experiencing, that we're all experiencing. So my goal here really is to just kind of give some additional exposure to you on what this could look like. What does it look like when you're incorporating social sciences into your work? And what does that mean as we move forward? So I'll do a little bit more of my own background here as soon as I figure out how to move the slides. So I started my undergraduate career with broadcast meteorology aspirations. At Purdue, when you say interdisciplinary, the disciplines don't actually need to have any intersection whatsoever. So I did computer science, physics, chemistry, biology, and atmospheric sciences. And then you get support. And I was like, oh, anthropology. But you're probably thinking like, oh, she's really into humans. So she probably did like ethnographies and studied cultures. No, I followed vervet monkeys and baboons in South Africa and Botswana. But I also really found Spanish a ton of fun. Wrote more papers in Spanish than I did in English while at Purdue because they didn't require any writing in atmospheric sciences. But as you can see in this top left picture, my broadcast aspirations also translated in Spanish. So I would do our university weekly forecasts in Spanish. And if there was someone who wanted to do English, then I would let them do English because I'll just take over the Spanish part. But as I went through my bachelor's degree at Purdue, way out in Indiana, it was just like, okay, yeah, we're going to do broadcast. I'll figure something out. But all of my classmates were really into chasing. I was much more of my mom is going to wear suede boots and she wants to know if it's going to rain. So I am her meteorologist purely for fashion purposes. Like, is she going to ruin her jacket because of the weather? So that was kind of my initial lead into meteorology. And I reluctantly went to my first AMS as I was graduating from Purdue. And was like, oh, I really want to do like educating the public as they have so many questions. I was an intern at NBC for several summers while in undergrad, and it was always call like, oh, they said scattered, well, what percentage is that in Bethesda? And I'm like, it's scattered, man, I'm so sorry, I don't know what else to tell you. But there were all these questions, and also the super outbreak of 2011, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that had come up, and I'm like, if I can do a forecast for that, because I hated the forecast game, and I was terrible at it, but if I can accurately forecast tornadoes, how are we still having hundreds of fatalities? So that's when I became interested in, we have to look at that understanding. So just like when Brian mentioned in the intro, if we have a perfect forecast and no one gets it, then it's not that helpful. So after I reluctantly went to AMS, I was recruited into a graduate program at Howard. My mom came up with this new rule that you had to have a master's degree, and I was like, well, I guess this is my chance. So came to Howard for my master's and was swiftly recruited into the doctoral program instead. At the time, Howard did not have anything interdisciplinary, so I got to take all of my sociology, psychology, and demography classes with no additional credit whatsoever. So I am a social scientist with an atmospheric sciences degree. Like, they were so kind as to let me do my qualifying exams in atmospheric physics. So lucky me. But we keep hearing about social sciences. It's becoming more popularly, you're hearing about it all the time, but what does it really mean? And where does that come from? A lot of times we'll go to AMS and you'll hear someone say they have this new product and they're like, oh, and it was approved by social sciences. That is not a real thing. I don't know what that means. And you can talk to a ton of other people and they're like, I don't know what approved by social science means, because there are so many different aspects of social sciences. If you think more traditionally, what those fields look like, it's like political science, sociology, economics, psychology, anthropology. Those are the ones that you see traditionally associated with it. But what you see in practice and what actually happens, I would also add in communications and geography. Communications, I mean, broadcasting and putting out our messages, risk communication, all of that is part of social sciences, especially in terms of weather. And geography is pretty much a catch-all. So geography is really looking at the intersection between humans and their environment. And if that doesn't scream intersection of social sciences and meteorology, then I don't know what else could. But you're also probably thinking like, I'm not one of those, insert whatever degree field ever. So why is this lady coming and shoving more social sciences at me? And it's because it's kind of the direction that we're heading. I'm hoping that this works. But basically she just says, I'm tired of this. And that's so sorry.
You keep digging.
Coming, this is a direction that we're going. And this is where a lot of the funding is pushing us towards, is doing these integrations with social sciences and bringing them onto your research so that we can have these different viewpoints in our research. And so just to give you guys basically like the good old days Ruby Tuesday buffet of like a sampling of different pieces of social sciences, I'm just going to go through some of my own experiences over the last about decade or so in terms of some of the research that I've done and what has it looked like over different phenomena. A lot of times you'll talk to a meteorologist and they'll say like, oh, what do you work on? Be like, oh, I'm tropical. Oh, I'm mesoscale. Oh, I'm boundary layer. And then they talk to me and they're like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, hurricane, storm surge, flash flooding, tornado, hail, blah, blah, blah. So just going to go over them sort of briefly. And when I say briefly, think of it as her dissertation is one of these slides. That's the level that we're kind of at here, just to give sort of an example of what it's looked like for me, at least, as we go through. So some of my earlier stuff was related to Hurricane Katrina and specifically on people returning. So it was coming up on the 10-year anniversary of when Hurricane Katrina. At this time, I didn't have a lot of experience. So I got to be the person who listened to the focus groups and typed every single thing out. So I was the transcriber. Now we have computers and AI to help us with that. But Hurricane Katrina was a devastating event. But what we were curious about is who stayed in during Hurricane Katrina, why, and who returned. What was their timeline like? Do we see those differences there? So the book that you see, Policing and Natural Disasters, that's by my advisor, where she was investigating emergency management, so all emergency responders, so police, fire, EMS, folks like that. And their concerns were about, if I'm evacuating, like, am I gonna have a job to come back to? I haven't actually been released from service. So it's not always like, oh, we didn't have the money. There could be other constraints that come along. Another thing that we looked at was who was returning and when. Were there certain groups that were able to recover more quickly? And we did find cultural differences and ethnic differences. So folks who identified as Jewish were much more likely to recover quickly. A lot of people in the Asian community were able to recover more quickly and returned sooner than those who identified as Black or African American. So yeah, Hurricane Katrina focus groups was the big thing that we did in our research group with that. The other thing that was really important to me was that 2011 super outbreak. And again, like I mentioned, this came up during the forecast game and I was like, oh, there's definitely going to be tornadoes. But when we look at this image, so this is coming from the SPC. If you're not familiar, when you see this here and it says 45%, if you have bionic eyes, you could see that it says 45% in that really tiny font there. When you talk to a regular person, you say 45%, and you're talking about atmospheric sciences. Most people's familiarity in terms of probabilities is going to be probability of precipitation. And if you say 45%, you're like, ah, that's less than 50, it's fine. It's totally fine. But what you don't really necessarily say here is that, well, the highest value even on this legend is 60. So if your denominator is 60, 45 sounds a lot different than if it was out of 100. And so that's something that isn't necessarily communicated just in a graphic. And then you also need to take into consideration what's actually the threat. And if the threat here is tornado, then even if the probability is lower, if it does actualize, the destruction and the damage that could come along with that is really devastating. So having these numbers is something that we need to consider. And like we mentioned, if you have a really great forecast, which this I would argue is a great forecast, it was known well in advance that it was coming. People should have known about it. It was in newspapers, and it did actualize. We did have several hundreds of tornadoes happening that day. So why were there fatalities still? And that's when you get into some of the social sciences work. So if we look at the basis of human response model, it has these 6 different steps. And with each step is a potential gap. So if you start with receiving the warning, did you get it to your phone? Did you watch it on TV? In this particular event, in some areas, specifically in Alabama, there were power outages with the first round of storms, and there was 3. So that can knock out your receiving end. Do you understand it? Do you know what the warning that you received means? Is it in another language? Have you never experienced a tornado before? You're not from here. Then do you believe it? What if you have some really influential uncle who hates everything about a computer or something like that? No, anything like that. Like maybe you don't believe that this is happening, or maybe you have just received so many warnings that you just don't take them as seriously because you're basically in an almost cry wolf situation where you're constantly at risk, that you're constantly under threat. Then you need to go to confirming that information. And I put an asterisk there because that's going to keep coming up. So you saw it on the Weather Channel, but then you're like, they're a little shaky for me. Let me check Weather Underground. Let me check AccuWeather. Let me check my aunt who's always watching TV. And you can get into these cycles of just searching for more information, and that can delay you in actually responding. Personalizing the threat, as in like, okay, I understand that somebody is at risk or somebody in my state is at risk, but am I at risk? So personalizing that can really also be a big gap. And all of that has happened before you've actually put your shoes on and gone to your area of shelter. And even there, once you have decided to respond or to take that protective action, did you have sufficient resources to do it effectively? A lot of homes in the Southeast are what I would say frame homes. They're not necessarily mobile homes, but they're not like these really super strong brick structures. So they're just kind of a frame home, really. So even if you were doing your best attempt to protect yourself, maybe you couldn't effectively do it. But when 190-mile-an-hour winds come through, that's just a tough situation regardless of your protective actions. So moving on from there, some of my time at the hazardous weather test bed, back when I had the patients for curls, I was going out to the hazardous weather test bed at National Severe Storms Labs and National Weather Center out in Oklahoma. At the time, they were looking at the probabilistic hazard information tool, or feed, and they would do these displaced real-time events. And I was like, displaced real-time sounds so strange, but basically they would have a weather briefing that morning, and they would have all the radar information and this tool come through for end users to show them like the forecast as it was playing out. So we would do these like 2-hour little sagas to see how emergency managers responded to this new tool. Like, how are they making their decisions? How was National Severe Storms Lab using ensemble forecasting, and how were their forecasters putting in additional information? So I'll just super quickly, this little circle that's here, it says 92%. And when you're on the computer, if you hover over that, it'll pop up. Because it's red, it would have said tornado, and you got little commentary from the forecaster who said, oh, I think that this is potential for a tornado. So they would give their confidence level, why they think it's going to be a tornado, and things like that. But that takes quite a bit of effort from the forecaster to do it. Is it great? Sure, but does every forecaster have that sort of time? Maybe not. But then on the other side of that, in terms of the emergency managers and the emergency personnel who are doing that, there's several other influential factors. One of them, before we even get into these like psychology related ones, there is, what is their job? When you talk to these folks who are emergency managers, a lot of them are like, oh, well, I'm also my town's fire chief. And you're like, so you run the fire department and you're the emergency manager? Oh, I'm also the 911 dispatcher. Oh, I do IT for my town. And I'm like, how many jobs do you have? Like, how is it that you are managing emergencies while also 911 call operations, flag going to a fire? Or some of them will be like, oh yeah, I'm emergency management for the university and I have a doctorate in meteorology. And you're like, oh, and other people are like, I have my associates, and or I've just started college and I have my GED. So you have a vast number of education levels and what people are interested in. So there was some person who was from the military, and she was like, oh yeah, I do emergency management at this nuclear facility. And I was like, oh, no, that's that. So other things that we start to consider and that we test for in terms of people's decision making, all these fun little checkmark phrases. So someone's like, need for closure. Are you the kind of person who's like, I just have to make a decision. I'm not going to dilly-dally. And we just have to get something done. Or are you like my husband and you'll just sit there and be like, well, you know, maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. You never actually decide something and you stress out the other people that you're around. Numeracy is another thing that we really want to look at. So when we want to put out that 90% or 45%, are you the kind of person that's comfortable with numbers? Or have you told yourself since second grade, like, oh my gosh, I'm bad at math. Any numbers are going to be so horrible. You have to give it to me with words. That's something we have to consider if we want to have more probabilistic information go out. Everybody doesn't love numbers. Cognitive miserliness, it sounds very fancy, but it's basically like, I don't have time to be thinking about a ton of things. And so whatever I knew from beforehand, any shortcuts or heuristics that I could lean on, that's what I'm going to do. So if you are more miserly, I'm like, if you're Scrooge-like with your amount of thinking that you would like to put forward to something, then you're a cognitive miser. If you are probably in academia and you could sit and think about ideas for days, years on end, then you are not. Then that resource management. So not necessarily like, oh, I have 3 jobs, but what about the people or the town that you're in? My town doesn't have funding to do the new sirens, or we don't have funding to have a 100% emergency manager, or even the public that you're dealing with. You want to get them to prepare for an event and you say like, oh, we're gonna do this, this FEMA hurricane prep kit. And they all come thinking that you are going to give them a hurricane prep kit, when in reality, you're like, bring your like waterproof bag and fill it with cans of tuna or whatever it is. Sociopolitical factors emergency managers have to deal with, where it's like, if I say this, because the governor appointed me, they're gonna look bad and then I'm gonna get fired. So if I am very nervous about a particular event and I say we should shut everything down, evacuate, close roads, etc., if that inconveniences people, then the elected official is going to catch flack for that, and that's going to come back to me, which is a lot to be dealing with and thinking about when you're like, it's gonna be a flood, we have to close the roads, and be like, oh, but the governor. So then also forecaster confidence. This will also come up a lot when you're dealing with fire or that decision support services. So they build up a relationship with the forecaster and they've worked with them for a long time. And you'll talk to forecasters and be like, I said the same thing that I said like 2 hours ago. And I asked them like, why did you now decide to take action? They're like, oh, well, your voice sounded a little bit shakier and you seemed nervous, and that was my signal. Or sometimes out in Oklahoma, I'll have emergency managers say like, oh, well, I know if the specific person sends out an email or the alert, if he sent it, I've got to get on my stuff, because they learn the signatures. They figure out like, okay, when bad stuff happens, that guy talks. And so those are factors. Like, it's not anything from your radar. It was like, his voice was shaky, his eyebrow twitched, and so that's why we shut down. And these are the kinds of things that literally change people's reactions. And you see it actually, SUNY, Dr. Sutton had some new research out where people are saying like, I wasn't actually safer, but I was more confident. And people might know like, okay, this situation is a little bit more risky, but I'm certain about it. So they want the certainty. And they're really using you as a meteorologist as an instrument, as another factor in like, well, what does this mean? If you look nervous, then I'm nervous. If you look like you don't care, then I'm gonna care. Those are things that we find in terms of our research. Okay, then we get into, so this one is mostly on heavy precipitation. Sorry, I make all the slides. It's like, swear I made this myself, and then I'm like, what's coming next? Like, well, I'll find out with you. So framing is another thing that I have also gotten into. So just like your body language can speak certain things, how you say things. I'm like, if you've ever dealt with a toddler, how you say things can be very different. You can get a very different response for how you say things. And in this work here, is where I was combining things with ensemble forecasting along with the framing. So for my dissertation, because I was doing atmospheric sciences, I had to have more atmospheric sciences stuff, because they're like, you're too social, we don't like it. So I threw in some ensemble work there. That's what you see floating at the top. Because I wanted to do probabilistic, I wanted to have a single source for the probabilities that were there. So this was an experimental model out of NCAR. I was so excited because it was a low member model, and I made all these arguments to my advisors. I was like, oh, 9 members is totally enough. And he's like, try 30. But I got away with 9. So it was totally fine. But the other big thing, and I don't know if you guys, has anyone, like just by raise of hands, has anyone ever seen this book, this Thinking Fast or Slow? Okay, a few people. I'm like, I will spare you all, I don't recommend the book. Like, if you want to do like a 30-minute, I'm like, sorry for folks on Zoom, if you're like, I love it. I'm like, oh, it's amazing that you made it through. I struggled through this. So if you want to do like the 30-minute summary from an expert, go for it. Getting the book, yes. But overall, the basic thing that we're really talking about here are dual process theories. So in Daniel Kahneman's, I'm not saying that he's wrong about the whole Nobel Prize and everything, but there are these 2 phases of your thinking. Kahneman describes it as fast and slow thinking. So fast would be those feelings-based thoughts, or like things that are instinctual. When people, like, if somebody comes at you and you're like, okay, crap, that's not good. But if they're just like skipping along, you're like, oh, I know they're happy, and I can take information from that without being like, tell me, right now, how are you feeling? Like, I can tell. Versus that slow, which for some people, me, it's math. I have to sit down, I have to get a piece of paper and a pencil to do math. For some people, it's other things, but there are more deliberate things that you have to do, and the fast automatic, I didn't have to think about it, I just know. This is not the only dual process theory. Funnily enough, there is another one, and it's called fuzzy trace theory, which is at the top of this. And that's another dual process theory. And in that case, the two different frames of thinking are called fuzzy and verbatim. Fuzzy is related to like the heuristic. I don't really know where this comes from, but I know it just from my experiences growing up to be an adult, and the verbatim being that more specific, in this case, a probability, that type of information. So in fuzzy trace theory, they posit that you can receive both types of information at the same time, and you, as an adult, can process both ends of this information spectrum at the same time. And if you're given risk information with both fuzzy and verbatim types of information, then you're going to make better decisions. So, yes, at the same time. And for me, I thought maybe this could reduce some of that timeline with that information seeking. So if we can give you all the types of information you need in one message, are you going to feel like you need to check AccuWeather and Weather Underground and your aunt down the street and the TV, all of those things? So that was my intention, to test out this theory. So it had been used in medical decision making before, but not for weather. And so I'm hoping that I wanted to test if we gave people this fuzzy trace theory framed message, would they take action more quickly? So I had a whole scenario. There was like a flyer. You were going to this concert music festival for 2 days out of town, approximately 2 miles away from your hotel. Had all of these details where it was like, it's not that easy to get back. You could, what are you going to do? Are you going to skip the concert and go back to your hotel? Or are you going to be like, yeah, I'm in the mud or something like that? So that's what I was looking to see what people did. And to give an example of what this looked like in medical decision making. So when you're giving the verbatim, it could look like, okay, post-vaccination fever was noted among 12% of those aged 1 to 5 years and 5% among those aged 6 to 15 years. But when you add the fuzzy component, you say something like, overall, the risk is low and decreases with age. So this is going to be coming from your doctor. So they can tell you like, okay, you heard 12% and 5%. Me as an expert, I'm going to tell you that those are low and they decrease with age. And so basically this is the framework that I'm taking to say, okay, how could we do this for weather? And the story that I usually tell is like, imagine you're this like working mom. You've gotten everybody out of the door in the morning. You're about to go to your awesome Tuesday meeting and you get a ping to your phone. It's like, oh, flash flood warning for this evening. You're like, thanks, bro. Let me move on. You're going about your day, pickup has happened, and you get another one. Like, there's a 70% chance of flash flooding. You're like, ugh. Okay, now what do I really do? I don't really know what to do with that. And now it's time for dinner and you don't want to cook. And so you're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna do Chick-fil-A or I'm gonna like Uber Eats it. And you get another ping to your phone. But this time it says, there's a 70% chance of flash flooding. Any travel on the roads could be extremely dangerous. Oh, travel on the roads is extremely dangerous. Like, okay, fine, I'll make pancakes at home for dinner or something like that. But I'm not gonna Uber Eats it because they're gonna be traveling on the roads. So just adding in a little bit of context of what this could mean for somebody can change their actions. Just a side note, in terms of the dissertation work, when this was for the concert and the flash flooding, when people who were given the fuzzy trace theory-based message were more likely to evacuate more quickly. And then at the end, I did show everybody the 3 different messages, like, oh, there's one that's just a probability, one that's our traditional, like, oh, there's a warning, and then the combination of saying like what the potential impacts were. And they overwhelmingly preferred the one that gave all the information. And that was followed by the traditional message. And nobody liked the probabilistic, so much so that it changed my methods because I had so few people actually select liking the probabilistic that I couldn't even run the analyses that I wanted to. because they didn't like it. So it's not that they don't like probabilities, because the fuzzy one includes a probability as well, but there is something to be said for providing people with that additional context of what does this mean for me? So my latest work is involved with fire. So wildfire and prescribed, a little bit heavier in prescribed. And as you probably heard, like recently, even last summer, when we had all of that smoke coming through the East Coast from the Canadian fires and fires out in California, we have this history of suppression only for dealing with fire. Or so I thought. In certain areas in the Southeast, you see a lot more prescribed fire. But as we have avoided, fire and putting things out as quickly as possible, we've increased our own risk for severe wildfire, the ones that are like really hard to control, where you're calling folks from Australia and New Zealand to be like, please come put out our fires over here. One of the big things that we are looking at is the impact and tolerance of smoke, because if we're looking at trying to increase the amount of prescribed fire that we have to reduce this increased risk of severe wildfire, we have to consider like, okay, what could stop this? And so in doing interviews with people who are prescribed fire personnel, so people who work at like nonprofit organizations or even US Forest Service, when you talk to them, they're like, okay, there's all of this fear from past wildfires, when in some cases that incentivize people to be like, okay, we need good fire. And in other cases, they're like, we had a huge fire and I'm terrified. I don't want to see any smoke on the ground. I don't want to see any something. I don't want to smell anything, nothing. And we have such a difficult time when I ask my participants now, like, okay, what's your average timeline to get to a prescribed fire? The range right now that I've gotten is somewhere between 1 month and 5 years for one prescribed fire. So there are things that they have to deal with, like, okay, do we need trees to be cut down? If it's on federal land, then you need to put out a contract. Someone has to bid for it. Then they have to actually do it. If they cut it down, was it dry enough that I have to wait 3 years for this tree that I cut down to sufficiently dry out so that I can then burn it? There's a lot of different, it's basically just a ton of red tape. You have to make it a public announcement. And if somebody says that they don't want it, that can delay you even further. And that's before they've even gotten to any weather conditions to find out, like, do we even have the right conditions where I could light the ground? So sometimes it's like it's too cold, or they're waiting for rain to come the day after they want to do this prescribed fire. But one of the big things that I ask is, okay, well, what products do you use to find your weather information? And when do you need stuff? And they're like, oh, a 30-day would be great. And I'm like, well, wouldn't it? It would, and that would be great. But do we have that? No, we don't. 2 weeks, we're like, oh, almost, call me in 10 days. Call me at the 10-day mark. And just finding out, okay, so do you use NOAA products? And they're like, oh, I've seen them and those are really good, but I lost the link and now I can't find it. And every time I Google what I'm looking for, I just get weather underground. I'm like, I mean, that's what happens. And so people would say that, okay, what's produced at NOAA and from National Weather Service is some of the best information, but I can't find it. And they're like, well, I'll call my meteorologist friend, like a legit friend who happened to get a degree in meteorology, who's really into this. We'll send them the link, which they get a new computer. They're like, lost the link completely. But I don't think it should be that way. And we have to do something about, I know that everybody keeps hearing that, like, oh, the National Weather Service website sucks. Like, we know, but we legitimately need to do something about it, because these people are making really serious decisions. This man is walking around with gasoline and lighting the ground on fire. I really feel like we should know what the weather conditions are, because that's, to me, terrifying. They say, oh, it's kind of therapeutic. And I'm like, yeah. I don't know what kind of therapist you go to. Yeah, more like that. Like, oh, okay. If it works for you, it works for you. But these are the kinds of things that I'm looking at, asking them, like, what would be really helpful? And I've spent legitimately a decade trying to avoid boundary layer stuff, and unfortunately found out last week I can't escape it. And one of the things that I asked, what would be really helpful? because they get so much pushback from community members about smoke, in California, several burns were, they'll say postponed, and I'm like, if it's postponed for 4 years, maybe we should say it's canceled, but they said postponed. And it was because the vineyards were concerned about smoke taint for their wine. And they're like, I don't even know if this is real. Is that a thing? And it would be really great if we could have some help about smoke modeling. Where is this smoke going to go? Who's going to be impacted? What's the dispersion? What does that look like? And the other thing with prescribed fire is, like, when they're getting ready to do their mop up or the put the fire out is what it means. And they're saying, like, when the sun goes down, everything has changed. And I'm like, it's a low level jet. Crap. So bummed. I'm so bummed. I've gone so long avoiding everything with boundary layer till this came along. So yeah, so looking at things that would help in terms of smoke dispersion, where is it gonna go, pollution, and that has other implications. So that's something that meteorology can help out with in terms of finding out, like, okay, well, how long are we going to see any smoke or any particular in the air with certain conditions? Yeah, so that's where that is going. And a lot of times when we're looking at, like, what are the societal impacts of things, it's like, okay, with emergency managers, what is their biggest forecasting? Timing. They want to know, yes, they want to know when something starts, but they're very interested in when is something ending so that I can send somebody out to start doing rescue again. Because if they don't know when the last lightning strike is going to come through, or if they don't have the radius of that, then they're too nervous to send someone out to help, because they can't put their limited resources at risk until they know that a system has passed through completely. And for fire, that deals with the go or no go, like, do we light the ground on fire? Do we know what resources are going to be available? Things like that. And then my newest favorite subject is the actual National Weather Service workforce. So I don't know what your experience has been, but when I was an undergrad and we went to visit a local forecast office and they showed me the office and they were like, oh yeah, we have people who do shifts, people work overnight. And I was like, you guys have a great day. Not for me, no thank you, so sorry. But there are a lot of people who have a true passion for the service, which is so important. But what I'm concerned about is how much we're tasking meteorologists with, especially like when I think about fire and the incident meteorologists, where you have 36 hours to get to this place that's on fire. Do you have internet? No. Do you need to bring all of your own equipment and computers? Yes. Do I need you to have a different risk communication message tailored for at least 6 different audiences by 5 a.m.? Yes, I do. Are there 5,000 people sleeping outside and don't know what their risk is unless you tell them that something is going to happen? No pressure. I know you're not from here and you just got here 15 minutes ago, but thanks. And I'm like, that feels like a lot. That feels like a lot. And what's happening is that some of the things that happen with incident meteorologists kind of get scaled up and pushed out. And that's really, depending on who you ask, where this impact-based decision support services comes from. A lot of it is based on what happened with incident meteorologists and what they produce. So, and the research that I'm analyzing now covered 4 regions of the US, the Eastern region, Central, Southern, and Western region for National Weather Service, and basically talking to NWS managers about, how do you do IDSS? What's your definition of IDSS? Because they all have a different definition. What are you doing? What's going on? Tell me about what's happening as this program rolls out. And then searching to see if there were any regional differences there. And there are. People brought up things like shift work and staffing challenges, even though that was not part of my interview guide at all. That's something that's so critical, where they're mentioning, well, our office has never been fully staffed. And I'm like, so you're not fully staffed. You need to still produce all of the legacy products and put them on this website that only 4 people can find. And I also need you to make these new impact-based decision support services. Oh, you're not a social scientist? That's fine. I still need you to do impact-based decision support services. And in addition to that, I want you to be deployable. And like, let's see, I had some pictures. Deployable. So in terms of what IDSS looks like, Raleigh happened to have photos that I could get. So they do these, it's hard to tell which one's in person, but one of the top is the in-person deployed. The cooler one is like when they're like at NASCAR and they're like under the tent, like doing forecasts and stuff, or they'll do it virtually, which is why he has a phone pointing at the computer. Or they are also doing like an emergency operations center where it's kind of like a room like this full of decision makers and they're giving a briefing on what it is. But one of the other problems is that they couldn't get AWIPs. They couldn't use AWIPs when they were out because it just takes up too much bandwidth and they didn't have strong enough internet connection. And so it's very recently, as in like last year, some of them can get cloud access to AWIP so that they can actually have their most productive information source while they're being deployed in these critical situations. Another thing that was really difficult was like getting staff buy-in. Again, if you're like, I don't want to talk to people, I was a meteorologist so I could sit behind my computer and clickety click. If I wanted to talk to people, I would have been a broadcaster. And things like that. It's not fun to keep getting asked to do things. And so then they throw in this executive order for the service equity. It's like, okay, so now they have this new thing from President Biden. I'm like, well, where exactly did this executive order come in? If you again use your bionic eyes, you'll see all the way down at goal number 5, service equity, which is now a requirement for National Weather Service offices to make attempts to reach the most underserved communities that they've probably never talked to, which is why they would technically be underserved. And they suggest, like National Weather Service says, like, oh, use the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. So I just pulled up New York, and this is what it looks like. Now what do you do? It's like, that's, okay, so now it's like, okay, so I look for dark blue, like, do I know anybody there? Like, again, you're a forecaster, but I also need you to find all of these vulnerable groups somehow. Even if you were a social scientist, like community engagement was not like my first thing. It's not what I'm best at. So it's just tough to kind of be like, okay, just do this, just one more thing. I mean, it's just they're constantly being asked to do more. It's like, don't stop any of the other work that you had to do, but add in like outreach to all these other communities, and I'll see you for your 10 p.m. shift that starts then, and just stay overnight. And it's just like, how much more are we asking meteorologists to do? Because I've had some IMEDs yesterday mentioning like, I have 50 tabs open. I'm like, that's a lot. So they have too much information. It's an information overload even on the forecasting side. And we see that same information overload on our end users. So yeah, more requirements, same resources. And some people said like, if I could get a script to engage, like, is there an email that I should send? What should it say? Can I get like a NOAA t-shirt or like I Heart NWS or anything? Nope. Support with language barriers, or even defining who is a partner. So you might think like, oh yes, we're going to partner with the school district. Like, NOAA headquarters doesn't necessarily consider school districts. They don't even consider like a lot of health centers to be core partners. And it's like, they are at risk. Like if we have smoke and there's a bunch of children, feels like we should probably be partnering with them. So these are just some things that happen, but it's not all bad, I swear. It's not all bad. I don't know what the good is, but there is some good. Like we have a passion for helping people. Social scientists have it, and so do meteorologists. So my aim really is to highlight how interconnected our fields already are. And even if you were thinking like, oh, I don't do any of that stuff, I just like to play with my measurements on the rooftop. No, but you are still a human. And so, yeah, your work already has a human impact. And the other big goal is to have more atmospheric scientists be comfortable talking about their work and sharing what it is that they do, because we can have all of these different connections. Someone this morning was like, how do you know Brian? I'm like, how do I know Brian? I don't even know. It was like my advisor knows somebody that he was working with, but she couldn't come to this meeting, and so she asked me to go instead, and then I've worked with him for 2 years after that. But having these things, sharing what your passion is, even if it's not, directly related to some human impacts, it does have that human impact. And so the work that you're doing is important. And just like you're thinking like, oh, I'm not a social scientist and I don't know what they're talking about, they do not know what you're talking about either. They don't. So don't be afraid to share it. Don't be afraid to give like the basics. I still remember I was at this, I don't know, some sort of like scholar society, blah, blah, blah. And some guy was like, oh yeah, I do chemistry. And I was like, oh yeah, tell me about it. And he was like, oh, it's like cooking. I'm like, yeah. So what do you do? I'm like, what's your research on? Like, it was a research conference and he like refused to tell me beyond like, it's like cooking. And I'm like, is it like cooking a chicken? Is it like cooking a souffle? Cause those are different. Like, help me out. And so I beg you, please just start to get comfortable with like, what is your research? What does it mean for regular people? Just because I think that we have to be working together as we go forward. So that is all I have for you today. If you do have like, random stuff you want to email me about, or you're like, what are the citations? Because I didn't make a references slide, you can always just ask me. And yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. I want to go back. First, thank you very much for this. It's very eye-opening. I really enjoyed it. So let's go back to a meteorologist who is given these vulnerable areas where underrepresented groups are.
Yeah.
And yeah, from New York all the way from North Buffalo area all the way down to New York City. And earlier on, you said context does matter, but then context is not gonna be constant.
True.
So tell me how this poor meteorologist is gonna deal with that.
This poor meteorologist is so lucky because there are an increasing number of social scientists who are doing more of this work and are realizing to partner with meteorologists and atmospheric scientists and these other physical sciences. So context is always changing. And so it's more about, a lot of it is just being cognizant of like, what's going on, what language is being used. Before you just send something out, just being like, oh, well, I'm the expert in this, like maybe have somebody else look at it. So one of the things that happens that one of my colleagues is dealing with is that there's somebody who's like really excited and they want to change all of the colors in this thing. And they're like, oh, well, I already know because that's what I like. And then I asked my wife and she likes it too. So then we're good to go. Like, actually, it doesn't work out that way. So the other thing that I would say for meteorologists is to also be patient, because sometimes, most of the time, social sciences research takes quite a bit of time. As some of my colleagues here note, when you're trying to collect this, regular person, like general public data, like for the National Weather Service, those interviews, my response rate was 21%. So of the like 250 people that I reached out to, like specifically like from their liaison of like who to reach out to, I got about 50. So response rates are hard. So it takes some extra time. So I would just say to be ready for there to be a little bit of extra time before you send something out, checking things with other folks and realizing that just because you asked your cousin if they like this new idea that you have, doesn't make it social sciences. But yeah, it's just like context is always changing, and even just being aware of that is already going to be a step forward.
Yeah, I think in your Tuscaloosa paper, there was an issue where people were not personalizing.
Yeah.
So is that something that the dual theory you were talking about helps with in messaging, or what do we know about how we can allow people to more personalize warnings?
Yeah, so the personalizing is very difficult. So we did some focus groups afterwards. People would say like, what really personalized the risk was. Like, well, my mom called me and she sounded terrified for me. And that's what kind of does it. Another person said, oh, I was glued to the weather channel for 12 hours and then my power went out. And I'm like, you were watching, knew that this was coming, and it wasn't until your power went out to where you couldn't watch anymore. And that's when you decided to take protective action. A single, completely able-bodied person with no responsibilities or needs is like, oh, okay, in that situation, fine that you waited until the very last minute. But I'm hoping that the framing and things from fuzzy trace theory can help with at least engaging the action. I'm not necessarily sure that it directly relates to the personalization aspect, but I'm still just trying to, get people to take action. So I'm hoping that it does. The problem that I found with fuzzy trace theory, so when I did it for heavy precipitation, great. When I did it for severe, great. Any winter precip, the whole theory fell apart. So I don't know, I hate winter precip too, but I have not found a theoretical framework that works with precipitation in terms of changing those understandings, but it's also because that forecast is a lot of times more complicated as well. So I got stuff until you get to winter precip, then I have no idea.
I think so Joe Ripper is here at Oklahoma. They've like synthesized like maybe some 10 or 11 recommendations of like using policy information. And from that, a lot of that's coming from different fields, this and that. How like for like meteorologists that have a lot going on, how do we streamline and like link all this and find connections like with maybe generative AI or other things like that? Like you speak to some of that? Like how
Yeah, so, okay, just to hear the question where it's like, because there's so many different fields that are doing this sort of thing, but it's not necessarily coming as a collective within like a NOAA sphere. How do we streamline that or?
I was kind of getting more at like there's a lot of meteorology examples, like the doctor helping a patient interpret stuff, and like there's just a lot of social science stuff that has indirect links to meteorology and decision making and behavioral science. So how do we like link all that together and then like apply it to meteorology?
Yeah, so it's coming along slowly, but I think a lot of that is in terms of just having people in-house, like social scientists in-house. So hiring economists, hiring people from psychology, hiring people from these different fields. So at GSL now, like just last year, like July of 23 is when they just started their social and behavioral sciences branch within like one department in WIDS, in GSL, in NOAA. And for me, having this team of, there's 5 of us, and that is that's the biggest team I've ever got to work with of different social sciences. So I really think it's just going to be really having more federal social sciences folks who are really only focusing on weather stuff. Because there's so many different aspects of it that get touched, but because a lot of those other researchers, they're not directly looking at weather information. So I really think it just comes from hiring and just getting people to be working on it full time.
Hi, David, Weather Service. I think, one of the challenges that you have with all of this is that our customer is everybody.
Everybody.
Right, and we don't have the time or the staff to tailor everything to everybody, so we've sort of highlighted emergency management and those folks.
Yeah.
To get, IGSS briefings, for example.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I struggle with is the person in our office who is responsible for training everybody. We have to keep up with radar information, maybe with the satellite stuff, model guidance, all the things that we were doing 10, 15 years ago, we still have to do, as you mentioned.
Right.
But trying to integrate some of this new stuff, and what I find is that oftentimes we find conflicting information coming out of the social science. Eric here mentioned before, Joe Ripper's group has come up with some guidelines. It's great, but I think where we struggle on a day-to-day basis is how to best integrate that so that there's some consistency.
Yeah,
And I think that's where the sort of tsunami of social science information that we're getting out from all over the place, even within our own agency, I think it's overwhelmed folks.
yeah, I would agree. I would say that, so in graduate school, so I was basically like, had a lot of time in the sociology department and a lot of time in atmospheric sciences. If you wanted peace, you were in the atmospheric sciences side. If you wanted to watch people squabble as scholars, then you were over in the sociology side. So there can be conflicting information because when your audience is everybody, what's right for one group is not right for the next group. So I think it's just a problem overall because there are so many different audiences and there are so many different needs that I don't know how we're going to get through that, because IDSS is a great idea to be able to tailor information, and if you can get it to like a high impact user, like an emergency manager who can then disseminate it, that's great. But when you have a bunch of different partners and you have a bunch of different needs, what you do has to change. Just like you mentioned, context is always changing. And for different people, your context is changing. For different regions, your context is changing. For different cultural groups, the context is changing. So it's just a compounding complexity of what we're dealing with. And the fact that there aren't necessarily additional resources makes it difficult. So I would love to say like, oh, every single time this works. But that's why I tried to look at something like message framing that's slightly more general, that can reach a broader audience, and just kind of get things on like what we know for adults overall, rather than seeing changes for different, regions or phenomena, because it also changes based off of what the weather context is as well. So sorry, that wasn't a great answer because I'm just like, it actually just sucks.
But, yeah, just before I can sympathize with what's going on. I mean, the question is, it's kind of a philosophical question, right? The Weather Service can only do so much,
Yeah,
and they're already, overtasked. So what is the path, in your view, what is the path forward? I mean, is there other ways to tackle this problem? In the past, in weather prediction, what's helped is, the private sector.
yeah,
I mean, then they gravitated and they do their modeling and have outreach or, customers. And then, there was some tension, weather service, private sector, but I think that's relaxed a little bit on that end. So are there other ways to kind of deal with, the especially the vulnerable populations and the folks that, need the information? How can, in your view, the community work together to maybe target, finally,
yeah.
the holy grail, so to speak, of getting down to that?
Holy Grail, I have no idea, because it's basically just like that research to operations conundrum.
Yeah.
So as a researcher, I'm always gonna say like, well, we need more research, and it's like, okay, at some point, I need us to do a thing. And even when we say vulnerable populations, like, okay, well, which type of vulnerability? And so I don't know. It's just a tough one where it's like, we need to have more people looking at this. Hopefully we can do more to find stuff that's more generalizable, that's simpler, that takes some things off the plate of meteorologists. I didn't forget your AI comment. That's still in the back of my mind because I just submitted something to BAMS about ChatGPT and what we can use for emergency managers trying to translate information so that they don't have to, like, I know some emergency managers will be like, oh yeah, we'll like call them, and I'm like, wow, call somebody. For me, it's a millennial, I'm like, that's wild. And but like, to take the time, I'm like, I can't do anything else if somebody calls me. I'm like, I don't know, I'm like crippled. So avoiding that and like making stuff simpler so we can reduce these like information seeking behaviors. Like, how can we condense the information that we're given so that people get as many needs as possible met beforehand? But how we define vulnerable, like which type of vulnerability, I think that my sociology brain kicked in when it was, once you start talking about like going private, a lot of people will argue that a lot of our disasters now are by choice because of the choices that we've made in terms of disadvantaging different areas or putting certain people at risk and not supporting them, then we've kind of set ourselves up to have these different, let's see, changes in what people have and what they don't have. So it's a tough one. Everything is complex and difficult. And I gave that academic answer, like, oh, we need more research.
Yeah. Well, lots of opportunities. And so
Lots of
your
opportunities.
talk
That's
has
my
been very
point is that.
enlightening here. So let's thank Shadya again.